the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Thunderbolt that scorching Tuesday afternoon. Rifle barrels gleamed like silver daggers across the firing line, but the scoreboard told a story of complete devastation. 3 of the most decorated Marine marksmen in the entire Southwest Division stood frozen behind their weapons, sweat dripping onto their scopes, their legendary reputations crumbling with every missed shot. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's when Corporal Jake Bullseye Morrison decided to play what he thought would be the perfect prank. He handed his custom rifle to the quiet woman sitting nearby and smirked. "Hey lady, want to show us how it's done?" What happened next would shatter every record on that base and leave an entire company of Marines questioning everything they thought they knew about precision shooting. By the time she hit her 101st consecutive target, the woman they'd dismissed as just another civilian contractor had become a legend. But let's start from the beginning, when failure hung in the desert air like a toxic cloud. Staff Sergeant Ryan "Deadeye" Patterson slammed his bolt-action rifle down with enough force to rattle the steel table beneath it. His weathered hands that had steadied through sandstorms in Iraq and frozen mountain passes in Afghanistan, were trembling with pure frustration. For the past 4 hours, Patterson had been attempting the quarterly precision shooting assessment at Camp Thunderbolt's elite marksmanship range. This wasn't some basic qualification course. This was the proving ground where only the Marine Corps' finest shooters came to test their skills against targets positioned at distances that would make civilian hunters weep. Patterson had earned his nickname Deadeye through 12 years of flawless service. His personnel file read like a marksman's fantasy: expert badges in every small arms category, instructor certifications from Quantico, and a combat record that included 17 confirmed kills during 3 deployments. Other Marines whispered stories about Patterson threading bullets through chain-link fence holes at 800 yards, about shots made in zero visibility conditions that seemed to defy physics itself. Yet today, Patterson had managed only 43 successful hits out of 100 attempts. 43. The number burned in his mind like acid. To his left, Gunnery Sergeant Tommy "Laser" Rodriguez was having an equally catastrophic day. Rodriguez, a compact man with forearms like steel cables and eyes that could spot movement at impossible distances, had built his reputation on consistency. In 15 years of service, Rodriguez had never scored below 85 on any marksmanship evaluation. Never. His fellow Marines often joked that Rodriguez's rifle was surgically attached to his shoulder, that bullets bent to his will, through pure force of concentration. But the scoreboard showed Rodriguez's count frozen at a humiliating 39 hits. His signature steady breathing technique had abandoned him completely. Every shot that should have been automatic, routine, effortless, was sailing wide or falling short. Rodriguez kept checking and rechecking his scope adjustments, his muscle memory screaming that something fundamental had gone wrong with the universe itself. The third member of this elite trio was perhaps the most shocking failure of all. Corporal Jake Bullseye Morrison, at only 26 years old, was already being whispered about as the next generation of Marine Corps shooting excellence. Morrison had arrived at Camp Thunderbolt 18 months earlier with a reputation that preceded him like thunder. During advanced training at the Mountain Warfare Training Center, Morrison had achieved the impossible, a perfect 100 out of 100 score on the most challenging, long-range course in the entire Marine Corps arsenal. Morrison's specialty was adaptive shooting. While other marksmen excelled in controlled conditions, Morrison thrived in chaos. Wind shifts, temperature changes, equipment malfunctions, time pressure, these obstacles that crippled other shooters only seemed to sharpen Morrison's focus. His instructors had documented shots made in conditions where veteran snipers couldn't even acquire their targets through their scopes. Today, Morrison was sitting at 52 hits, and each miss felt like a personal betrayal from his own body. The 3 Marines had arrived at Camp Thunderbolt's Range Charlie before dawn, carrying their personal weapons and enough confidence to power a small city. Range Charlie wasn't just any shooting range. It was a 2,000-yard stretch of desert wasteland designed to break even the most arrogant marksmen. Targets were positioned at varying distances, from 300 to 1,800 yards, with environmental factors that changed hourly. Desert winds that could shift direction without warning, heat mirages that made distant objects dance like ghosts, and elevation changes that demanded mathematical precision most Marines could only dream of achieving. The quarterly assessment was legendary throughout the Marine Corps. Only shooters with spotless records and special recommendations were even permitted to attempt it. A passing score of 75 hits was considered exceptional. Anything above 85 was career-defining. Scores above 90 were the stuff of base legend. These 3 Marines had expected to compete against each other for the highest score. Patterson had privately been aiming for 95. Rodriguez had quietly set his personal goal at 92. Morrison had been dreaming of achieving back-to-back perfect scores, a feat that would have made him the youngest Marine in history to accomplish such a milestone. Instead, they were failing spectacularly, publicly, in front of a growing crowd of observers that included junior Marines, civilian contractors, and worst of all, their fellow instructors from other bases who had come to witness what they'd expected to be a masterclass in precision shooting. The heat was becoming unbearable. Sweat stung their eyes. Their rifles, precision instruments that had never let them down before, felt foreign and uncooperative. Every fundamental skill they'd mastered through thousands of hours of training seemed to have evaporated in the Arizona sun. That's when she appeared at the edge of the range, quiet as a desert breeze. The reputation of these 3 Marines wasn't built on empty boasts or inflated stories shared over beers in the enlisted club. Their credentials were carved in steel, documented in official records, and whispered about in military circles from Pendleton to Paris Island with the kind of reverence usually reserved for combat legends. Staff Sergeant Ryan "Deadeye" Patterson's military service jacket read like a masterclass in marksmanship excellence. 12 years earlier, as a fresh-faced recruit from rural Montana, Patterson had arrived at boot camp, already knowing his way around firearms thanks to a childhood spent hunting elk in the Rockies with his grandfather. But what the drill instructors discovered during his first week on the rifle range was something far beyond typical backwoods shooting skills. Patterson's boot camp marksmanship scores weren't just impressive, they were historically unprecedented. Out of a possible 250 points on the Marine Corps rifle qualification, Patterson scored 247. The 3 points he lost came from a single shot that the rangemaster later determined was actually a perfect bullseye. But the electronic scoring system had malfunctioned. His drill instructors immediately flagged him for advanced marksmanship training. By his second year of service, Patterson had earned expert badges in every weapon system the Marine Corps issued. Rifle, pistol, squad automatic weapon, even the ancient 50 caliber machine guns that most Marines struggled to fire accurately. Patterson mastered them all with an almost supernatural precision. During his first deployment to Fallujah, Patterson's platoon commander began requesting him specifically for Overwatch missions that required impossible shots. The legend of Deadeye Patterson was born on a suffocating August night in 2018, when insurgents had pinned down a convoy of humanitarian workers in a narrow alley. The only clear shot was through a gap between 2 buildings, At 847 yards, in complete darkness, with a crosswind that was shifting every few seconds, Patterson's commanding officer told him to take the shot, only if he was absolutely certain. One miss would give away their position and likely result in the execution of 12 civilians. Patterson fired once. The insurgent dropped instantly. The convoy escaped. The after-action report noted that ballistics analysis showed Patterson's bullet had traveled through a space no wider than 8 inches between concrete walls before finding its target. The shot was later used as a case study at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. Gunnery Sergeant Tommy Laser Rodriguez represented a different breed of marksmanship excellence entirely. Where Patterson relied on instinct and natural talent, Rodriguez had built his reputation through obsessive technical precision and an almost robotic consistency that defied human limitations. Rodriguez had grown up in East Los Angeles, where his first exposure to firearms came not through hunting or recreational shooting, but through a police athletic league program designed to keep teenagers off the streets. What started as an after-school activity quickly revealed an extraordinary gift. By age 16, Rodriguez was outperforming adult competitive shooters at local matches despite using borrowed equipment and having no formal training. When Rodriguez enlisted in the Marine Corps, he brought with him a methodical approach to marksmanship that impressed even veteran instructors. While other recruits struggled to understand the mathematical concepts behind ballistic trajectory and wind calculation, Rodriguez absorbed these principles like a human computer. He could recite ballistic coefficients, calculate wind drift in his head, and adjust for atmospheric pressure changes faster than most Marines could work with calculators and reference charts. Rodriguez's specialty became extreme long-range precision work. During his time as a primary instructor at the Scout Sniper School, Rodriguez developed training protocols that are still used today. His students consistently achieved qualification scores 15–20% higher than the Marine Corps average. Fellow instructors would often observe Rodriguez's classes just to study his teaching methods. The nickname Laser came from Rodriguez's legendary consistency. During one memorable demonstration for visiting officers from other military branches, Rodriguez fired 50 consecutive shots at a target 100 yards away. All 50 shots landed within a circle no larger than a dinner plate. The Air Force colonel observing the demonstration remarked that Rodriguez's accuracy was so consistent it looked like he was firing a laser beam rather than bullets. But perhaps the most remarkable member of this trio was Corporal Jake Bullseye Morrison, whose rapid rise through the Marine Corps marksmanship hierarchy had become the stuff of base legend. Morrison represented the new generation of Marine marksmen, younger, more adaptable, and seemingly immune to the pressure situations that had historically separated good shooters from great ones. Morrison's background was unconventional for a Marine. Raised in suburban Denver by parents who were both college professors, Morrison had never shown any particular interest in firearms or military service during his teenage years. He was more likely to be found in the school's computer lab than on any athletic field. His decision to enlist had shocked his family and friends, who had expected him to follow his parents into academia. What nobody anticipated was how Morrison's analytical mind would translate to marksmanship excellence. Where other Marines relied on muscle memory and repetitive training, Morrison approached each shot like a complex equation to be solved. He would analyze wind patterns, study light conditions, calculate atmospheric effects, and make micro-adjustments that seemed almost psychic in their precision. Morrison's breakthrough moment came during advanced training at the Mountain Warfare Training Center in California. The final examination was a grueling 72-hour field exercise that combined land navigation, survival skills, and precision shooting under extreme stress. Students were required to make shots at unknown distances, in rapidly changing weather conditions with minimal sleep and maximum pressure. Morrison didn't just pass this examination, he achieved something that instructors had previously considered impossible. Every single shot he fired during the 72-hour period was a confirmed hit. 100 shots, 100 hits, under conditions that had caused previous classes to achieve pass rates below 60%. The instructors initially suspected equipment malfunction or scoring errors. After triple-checking their data and reviewing video footage, they were forced to conclude that Morrison had achieved perfect accuracy under the most challenging conditions in Marine Corps training. These 3 Marines hadn't just earned their reputations through single exceptional performances. Their excellence was documented across years of consistent achievement through multiple deployments in training environments and combat situations, witnessed by hundreds of fellow Marines and officially recorded in their service records. Their failure today wasn't just surprising, it was utterly unprecedented. The first sign that something unusual was about to unfold came not with fanfare or announcement, but with the soft crunch of desert gravel under worn hiking boots. While the 3 elite Marines continued their frustrating battle against targets that seemed to mock their every attempt, a figure approached the observation area with the kind of quiet confidence that somehow made her more noticeable than if she had arrived with sirens blaring. Dr. Sarah Blackthorne moved through the crowd of gathered Marines and civilian contractors like water flowing around stones, present, acknowledged, but somehow separate from the testosterone-heavy atmosphere that typically dominated military shooting ranges. At first glance, she appeared to be exactly what her paperwork indicated, a civilian ballistics consultant contracted by the Department of Defense to observe and evaluate current Marine Corps marksmanship training protocols. Her appearance was deliberately unremarkable. Blackthorne wore faded khaki pants that had seen better days, a simple white cotton shirt with sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and a weathered baseball cap that bore no unit insignia or identifying marks. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested function over fashion. She carried a small notebook and a digital camera, standard equipment for someone whose job involved documenting training procedures and outcomes. But there were subtle details that set Blackthorne apart from the typical civilian observers who occasionally visited Camp Thunderbolt. Her movements possessed an economy and precision that suggested extensive physical training. When she crouched to examine something in the dirt, her balance was perfect, her posture controlled. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in details with the kind of systematic observation patterns that spoke of professional experience in high-stakes environments. Most notably, Blackthorne's attention wasn't focused on the obvious drama playing out at the firing line. While other observers whispered about the shocking poor performance of the 3 legendary marksmen, Blackthorne was studying elements that everyone else was ignoring. She would pause to test wind direction with a blade of grass, observe the way heat waves distorted the view downrange, and occasionally make brief notes that she shielded from curious glances. The civilian contractors and junior Marines who had gathered to witness what they'd expected to be a masterclass in precision shooting found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with the unfolding disaster. Conversations became hushed, nervous. Some began drifting away, unwilling to watch their heroes fail so publicly and completely. The atmosphere grew thick with second-hand embarrassment and confusion. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Iron Mike Harrison, the base's senior marksmanship instructor, stood 20 yards behind the firing line, with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched so tight that muscles bulged along his neck. Harrison had personally trained 2 of the 3 Marines currently failing, and their performance was reflecting poorly on his reputation and training methods. He kept glancing at his watch, clearly hoping this nightmare would end soon so he could conduct damage control on what was shaping up to be a career-damaging incident. Blackthorne approached the observation area during Patterson's 73rd attempt, which sailed wide of the target by at least 2 feet. The shot was so far off that the electronic scoring system didn't even register an impact. Patterson's curse was loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone present, followed by the distinctive metallic clang of his rifle bolt being cycled with unnecessary force. "Excuse me," Blackthorne said quietly to a young Marine standing near the scoring table. Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the desert air. "Could you tell me what distance they're shooting?" Lance Corporal Timothy Brooks, a 19-year-old from Ohio who was serving as the range's assistant scorer, turned toward Blackthorne with obvious relief at having something to do, other than watch his heroes fail. "Ma'am, they're currently engaging targets at various ranges from 400 to 1,600 yards. This is the quarterly precision assessment. It's supposed to be the most challenging marksmanship test in the Marine Corps." Blackthorne nodded thoughtfully, making a brief note. "And what's considered a passing score?" 75 hits out of 100 attempts, ma'am. But these 3 Marines usually score in the 90s. Staff Sergeant Patterson holds the base record with a 97. What they're doing today." Brooks trailed off, clearly uncomfortable criticizing his superiors. "What they're doing today is very interesting," Blackthorne finished for him, her tone revealing nothing about her thoughts on the situation. Rodriguez's next shot produced another miss, this one falling short of the 800-yard target by a considerable margin. The sound of his frustrated exhale was audible even from Blackthorne's position. She watched him check his scope settings for what had to be the 20th time, saw him wipe sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, noticed the slight tremor in his shooting stance that indicated fatigue and stress were taking their toll. Morrison, the youngest of the 3, was having what could only be described as a complete breakdown of his legendary composure. His usual methodical approach to each shot had devolved into rushed, increasingly desperate attempts, where Morrison typically took 45 seconds to a full minute to prepare each shot, calculating every variable with mathematical precision. He was now firing within 15 seconds of acquiring each target. His frustration was manifesting as hurried aggression, the exact opposite of the calm, analytical mindset that had made him famous. Blackthorne moved closer to the firing line, close enough to observe the technical details of each Marine's shooting position and technique. To the casual observer, all 3 men appeared to be doing everything correctly. Their body positions were textbook perfect. Their grip and stance showed no obvious flaws. Their breathing patterns seemed controlled despite their obvious stress. But Blackthorne was seeing things that others missed. She noticed that Patterson was fighting a slight crosswind that was affecting his shots in ways he wasn't compensating for. Rodriguez was dealing with heat mirage effects that were causing him to misread his target distances. Morrison's rapid-fire approach was preventing him from properly reading the subtle environmental factors that his analytical mind normally processed automatically. More importantly, Blackthorne was observing that all 3 Marines were making the same fundamental error. They were shooting against the conditions rather than adapting to them. Their training had taught them to overcome environmental challenges through superior technique and mental discipline. But today's conditions were requiring something different: acceptance and adaptation, rather than domination and control. The crowd of observers had grown larger as word spread throughout the base about the spectacular failure taking place at Range Charlie. Junior Marines who should have been attending to their regular duties found excuses to drift toward the range area. Even some senior officers had appeared, standing in small groups and speaking in hushed tones about what this incident might mean for the Marine Corps' reputation for marksmanship excellence. Blackthorn remained apart from these groups, continuing her quiet observation and note-taking when Patterson missed his 80th shot and began what appeared to be the beginning of a complete emotional meltdown. She simply marked something in her notebook and continued watching. When Rodriguez threw his cap on the ground in disgust after his 80-second miss, she recorded the time and conditions without any visible emotional reaction. But when Morrison finally stopped shooting entirely, standing up from his firing position and staring downrange with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed, Blackthorn closed her notebook and began walking toward the firing line with deliberate, unhurried steps. The reaction to Blackthorn's approach toward the firing line was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations that had been conducted in hushed, respectful tones suddenly stopped entirely. Marines who had been trying to appear busy with equipment maintenance or administrative tasks found themselves openly staring at the civilian woman who seemed oblivious to the unwritten rules governing military shooting ranges. Lance Corporal Brooks felt his stomach clench with second-hand embarrassment. In his 2 years of service at Camp Thunderbolt, he had never witnessed a civilian contractor attempt to insert themselves into an active training exercise, particularly one involving Marines of Patterson, Rodriguez, and Morrison's caliber. The breach of protocol was so obvious that Brooks began looking around for Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, expecting immediate intervention. Sergeant First Class David "Tank" Thompson, a burly man from Texas who served as the range safety officer, took 3 quick steps toward Blackthorn with the clear intention of redirecting her back to the observation area. Thompson had 22 years of experience managing shooting ranges, and he recognized the signs of a situation that was about to become exponentially more complicated. His weathered face showed the kind of expression typically reserved for explaining obvious rules to particularly dense recruits. "Ma'am," Thompson called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated thousands of young Marines over the years. "I'm going to need you to step back to the designated observation area. This is an active firing exercise with restricted access." Blackthorn paused but didn't retreat. Instead, she turned toward Thompson with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both respectful and completely confident. "Of course, Sergeant. I apologize for the interruption. I was simply wondering if these gentlemen might benefit from a fresh perspective on their current challenges." The suggestion hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The implications of a civilian contractor offering shooting advice to 3 of the Marine Corps' most elite marksmen was so audacious that several observers actually took involuntary steps backward, as if they might be contaminated by proximity to such an unprecedented breach of military hierarchy and protocol. Staff Sergeant Patterson, who had been attempting to regain his composure after his latest series of misses, turned toward Blackthorn with an expression that combined disbelief, irritation, and something approaching indignation. His face was flushed red from a combination of heat, stress, and now the added humiliation of being offered unsolicited advice by someone who clearly had no understanding of military culture or protocol. "Ma'am," Patterson said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "I appreciate your interest, but I think you might be misunderstanding the nature of what's happening here. This is a Marine Corps precision shooting assessment. These aren't recreational target practice sessions where civilian input is particularly relevant or appropriate." Rodriguez, who had been checking his rifle's scope settings for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon, looked up from his weapon with the kind of expression that suggested he was questioning whether he was experiencing some kind of heat-induced hallucination. The idea that a civilian contractor would approach active-duty Marines during a formal assessment and offer shooting advice was so far outside his frame of reference that he seemed genuinely confused about how to respond. Morrison, still dealing with the psychological impact of his unprecedented poor performance, was perhaps the most visibly annoyed by Blackthorn's approach. As the youngest and newest member of this elite group, Morrison felt additional pressure to prove himself worthy of his reputation. The suggestion that he might benefit from civilian guidance felt like a direct challenge to everything he had accomplished during his meteoric rise through the Marine Corps marksmanship hierarchy. "Look, lady," Morrison said, his usual diplomatic demeanor cracking under stress. "I don't know what your background is or why you think you're qualified to offer advice, but we've been doing this professionally for a combined 30 years. Whatever problem we're having today, it's not something that's going to be solved by suggestions from someone who probably learned to shoot at a weekend course." The crowd of observers had grown silent in the way that groups become quiet when they sense they're about to witness something either spectacular or catastrophic. Junior Marines exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should intervene, retreat, or simply document what was shaping up to be a career-ending incident for multiple parties involved. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been attempting to maintain his distance from the unfolding disaster, realized that the situation had evolved beyond simple poor performance into something that could have significant administrative and public relations consequences. A civilian contractor openly challenging Marine Corps marksmanship expertise, particularly in front of multiple witnesses, was the kind of incident that generated official inquiries and uncomfortable conversations with superior officers. Harrison began walking briskly toward the firing line, his jaw set in the expression that Marines throughout his command had learned to recognize as a precursor to swift and decisive action. His plan was to politely but firmly escort Blackthorn back to the observation area and then conduct immediate damage control to prevent this incident from becoming base gossip or, worse, material for official reports. But Blackthorn seemed completely unaware of the storm of military protocol violations and cultural taboos swirling around her presence at the firing line. Her expression remained calm and interested, as if she were discussing weather patterns or lunch preferences rather than challenging the professional competence of 3 legendary marksmen in front of their peers and superiors. "I understand your perspective," Blackthorn said, addressing all 3 Marines with the same quiet confidence she had displayed since arriving at the range. "And you're absolutely right that you have significantly more formal training and professional experience than most civilians could ever hope to achieve. Your reputations are well-deserved, and your service records speak for themselves." The acknowledgement of their expertise seemed to diffuse some of the immediate tension, though confusion remained high among the observers. If Blackthorn recognized their superior qualifications, what exactly was she hoping to accomplish with her unprecedented intervention? "However," Blackthorn continued, her voice still soft, but carrying an undertone that suggested she wasn't intimidated by the military hierarchy surrounding her, "sometimes outside perspective can identify patterns that might be invisible to people who are deeply embedded in established approaches and methodologies. I've been observing your shooting for the past hour, and I think I might have noticed something that could be helpful." Rodriguez laughed, a sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "Lady, with all due respect, what you've been observing is 3 Marine Corps marksmanship instructors having the worst day of our professional careers. Unless you've got some kind of magical solution that the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School somehow missed during our training, I think you're probably overestimating your ability to contribute to this situation." Patterson nodded in agreement, his irritation clearly growing. "Ma'am, I've been shooting competitively and professionally for over 12 years. I've trained under instructors who wrote the Marine Corps Marksmanship Manual. I've made shots in combat conditions that most people would consider impossible. Whatever you think you've observed, I can guarantee you that we've considered and attempted every possible technical adjustment and correction." The dismissal was clear, comprehensive, and delivered with the kind of finality that typically ended uncomfortable conversations. The assembled Marines began to relax slightly, anticipating that Blackthorn would now retreat gracefully and allow them to return to their struggle against the mysterious forces that had destroyed their legendary accuracy. Instead, Blackthorn smiled. The smile that crossed Blackthorn's face wasn't the embarrassed retreat that everyone expected. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just heard exactly what they anticipated hearing, confirming something they had suspected all along. Her response came not as a defensive argument or an aggressive challenge, but as a simple, almost casual question that would change everything. "Would you mind if I borrowed one of your rifles for just a moment?" she asked, her voice barely above a conversational tone. "Just to test a theory I have about the conditions today." The request hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap in a clear sky. The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of a helicopter conducting training exercises several miles away seemed unnaturally loud. Marines who had been shuffling equipment or making small talk froze in place, unsure they had heard correctly. Morrison's mouth actually fell open. In his entire military career, he had never heard a civilian make such a request. Military weapons, particularly the precision rifles used by elite marksmen, were not casual tools to be shared with untrained personnel. The liability issues alone were staggering, never mind the breach of protocol and the potential security implications. Patterson's initial reaction was a bark of laughter that contained no amusement whatsoever. "Are you serious right now? You want to borrow a Marine Corps precision rifle? Lady, these weapons are worth more than most people's cars, and they're calibrated specifically for individual shooters. Even if regulations permitted civilians to handle military equipment, which they absolutely do not, you'd be firing a weapon that's been customized for someone else's physical characteristics and shooting style." Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief, looking around at the crowd of observers as if seeking confirmation that this conversation was actually happening. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand how this works. These aren't hunting rifles you can just pick up and use. Each weapon is individually configured with specific scope settings, stock adjustments, trigger modifications, and ballistic calculations that have been developed over years of training and field use." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been approaching the group to diffuse the situation, actually stopped walking and stood frozen in place. The request was so far outside normal parameters that he found himself momentarily unable to formulate an appropriate response. His training and experience had prepared him to handle insubordination, equipment failures, safety violations, and various other range emergencies, but a civilian contractor requesting to borrow a rifle from elite Marines wasn't covered in any manual he had ever studied. Sergeant Thompson, the range safety officer, looked like he might be experiencing the early stages of a cardiac event. His primary responsibility was ensuring that all range activities followed strict safety protocols and regulatory guidelines. Allowing an untrained civilian to handle military weapons would violate approximately 17 different regulations that he could recite from memory, and probably dozens more that would be discovered during the inevitable investigation that would follow. "Ma'am," Thompson said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional courtesy while dealing with what he considered an impossible situation, "I'm afraid that's completely out of the question. Range safety protocols prohibit unauthorized personnel from handling military weapons under any circumstances. The paperwork alone would take months to complete. assuming such a request could even be approved through proper channels. But Corporal Morrison, perhaps because his legendary confidence had been so thoroughly shattered by the day's failures, or perhaps because some part of his analytical mind was genuinely curious about what this strange woman thought she had observed, found himself considering the request more seriously than protocol would normally permit. "What kind of theory?" Morrison asked, ignoring the sharp looks from his fellow Marines. "What exactly do you think you've noticed that we haven't considered?" Blackthorn glanced toward the targets downrange, then back at the three Marines with an expression that suggested she was weighing her words carefully. "I think you're fighting conditions instead of adapting to them. You're trying to overcome environmental factors through superior technique and mental discipline, which works brilliantly under normal circumstances. But today's conditions aren't normal, and they're requiring a different approach entirely." Patterson's frustration finally boiled over into open anger. That's exactly the kind of generalized, meaningless advice that civilians always offer when they don't understand the technical complexity of what we're doing. Adapt to conditions, like we haven't spent our entire careers learning how to read wind, compensate for temperature changes, and adjust for atmospheric pressure variations. "You think we haven't considered environmental factors?" Rodriguez added, his voice rising. "Lady, I can calculate wind drift in my head faster than most people can do basic math. I've been shooting in desert conditions for 15 years. Whatever theory you have about adaptation, I guarantee you it's something we learned in basic marksmanship training." Blackthorn nodded thoughtfully, seemingly unbothered by their increasingly hostile responses. "You're absolutely right that you have extensive training in environmental compensation. Your technical knowledge is impressive, and your experience is far beyond what most people could achieve. But sometimes expertise can become a limitation when it prevents you from seeing simple solutions to complex problems." Morrison, despite his growing irritation, found himself genuinely curious about what Blackthorn thought she had identified. His analytical mind, which had been overwhelmed by the day's failures, began engaging with the puzzle she was presenting. "Okay, let's say hypothetically that you're correct and we're missing something obvious. What makes you think that borrowing one of our rifles would demonstrate whatever point you're trying to make?" "Because," Blackthorn said simply, "I think the problem isn't with your training or your technique or your equipment. I think the problem is with your assumptions about what today's conditions require, and the best way to test that theory would be to show you a different approach, using exactly the same equipment you've been struggling with." The crowd of observers had grown larger as word spread throughout the base about the unprecedented confrontation taking place at Range Charlie. Junior Marines who should have been attending to their duties found reasons to drift toward the area. Even some senior enlisted personnel and officers had appeared, drawn by reports that a civilian contractor was challenging the base's most elite marksmen. Lance Corporal Brooks, who had been watching the entire exchange, with growing amazement found himself caught between fascination with the unfolding drama and terror at the potential consequences for everyone involved. His experience told him that this situation could only end badly for all parties concerned, but some part of him was genuinely curious about whether Blackthorn could possibly back up her confident claims. Harrison finally managed to overcome his shock and resumed his approach toward the group, his expression clearly indicating that he intended to end this conversation immediately and permanently. But Morrison, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and wounded pride, made a decision that would change everything. "Fine," Morrison said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. "You want to prove a point? Let's see what you can do with my rifle. But when you embarrass yourself, I don't want to hear any excuses about unfamiliar equipment or inadequate preparation time. The gasp from the assembled crowd was audible and immediate. Patterson and Rodriguez turned toward Morrison with expressions of complete disbelief, while Sergeant Thompson began moving rapidly toward the group with obvious intentions of preventing what he correctly identified as a potentially catastrophic breach of protocol. But Morrison was already reaching for his rifle, his decision made with the same analytical certainty that had made him famous throughout the Marine Corps. If this civilian woman wanted to demonstrate her theory using Marine Corps equipment, then he would give her exactly that opportunity. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Patterson hissed, but Morrison was already extending his precision rifle toward Blackthorne with the expression that combined challenge, curiosity, and the desperate hope that someone might have an answer to the inexplicable failures that had destroyed their legendary reputations. "Proving a point," Morrison replied grimly, "one way or another." The moment Blackthorne's hands made contact with Morrison's rifle, the entire atmosphere at Range Charlie shifted in ways that defied logical explanation. What had been a chaotic scene filled with tension, embarrassment, and growing crowds of curious observers suddenly became something else entirely. A theater of absolute focus where every sound seemed muffled and every movement took on heightened significance. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been striding toward the group with clear intentions of ending this unprecedented breach of protocol, found himself slowing his approach despite his better judgment. Something about Blackthorne's demeanor as she accepted the weapon suggested that what was about to unfold might be worth witnessing, regardless of the regulatory violations and administrative complications it would certainly create. Blackthorne's first action upon receiving the rifle was to perform what appeared to be a completely routine safety inspection, but the way she conducted this basic procedure immediately caught the attention of everyone present. Her movements possessed a fluidity and precision that spoke of extensive familiarity with similar weapons systems. She checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, examined the bolt action with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested muscle memory rather than careful deliberation, and tested the trigger mechanism with the light touch of someone who understood exactly how much pressure was required for optimal performance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Staff Sergeant Patterson, despite his growing anger at the situation, found himself watching Blackthorne's weapon handling with grudging professional interest. Her grip and stance weren't exactly textbook Marine Corps methodology, but they demonstrated clear competence and suggested training from some source that he couldn't immediately identify. The way she balanced the rifle's weight and adjusted her hold showed familiarity with precision shooting that went far beyond recreational experience. Rodriguez noticed something else that struck him as significant. Blackthorne wasn't fighting the rifle's configuration the way most people would when handling an unfamiliar weapon. Morrison's rifle had been extensively customized over months of fine-tuning, with stock adjustments, scope settings, and trigger modifications that were specific to his physical characteristics and shooting preferences. Most people attempting to use another shooter's personalized rifle would struggle with the unfamiliar feel and setup, but Blackthorne seemed to adapt to the weapon's configuration with remarkable ease. Morrison watched with intense curiosity as Blackthorne conducted what appeared to be a brief assessment of the rifle's current settings. She examined the scope adjustments without making any changes, tested the stability of the bipod legs, and spent several moments familiarizing herself with the weapon's balance and weight distribution. Her approach suggested experience with equipment evaluation rather than casual experimentation. But it was Blackthorne's next series of actions that began to capture the serious attention of the observing Marines. Instead of immediately moving toward a shooting position, She spent nearly 5 minutes conducting what could only be described as environmental reconnaissance. She tested wind direction using techniques that weren't taught in basic marksmanship courses, holding up small pieces of grass at different elevations to detect air current variations, observing dust patterns at multiple distances downrange, and studying the behavior of heat mirages with the kind of systematic attention that suggested advanced training in atmospheric condition assessment. Sergeant Thompson, who had been preparing to enforce range safety regulations and end this unauthorized demonstration, found himself hesitating as he observed Blackthorn's methodical preparation routine. Her approach to pre-shot analysis was more thorough and sophisticated than what most Marines were trained to conduct, incorporating techniques that suggested familiarity with extreme long-range shooting challenges that went beyond standard military training. The crowd of observers had continued to grow, with word spreading throughout Camp Thunderbolt that something unprecedented was happening at Range Charlie. Junior Marines who had never witnessed elite marksmen in action were getting an unexpected education, while senior personnel found themselves drawn by curiosity about how this unusual situation would resolve itself. Lance Corporal Brooks, who had been documenting the day's shooting scores, realized that he was witnessing something that would likely be discussed and analyzed for years to come, regardless of how it ended. He began taking careful notes, instinctively understanding that accurate documentation of this incident would probably be important for the multiple investigations and reports that would inevitably follow. Blackthorn's environmental assessment seemed to confirm something that she had been suspecting, because her expression shifted from careful observation to what appeared to be quiet satisfaction. She made brief notes in her small notebook, recording wind patterns, temperature variations, and atmospheric conditions with the kind of detailed attention that suggested these factors were more significant than the Marines had realized. When Blackthorn finally moved toward a shooting position, her approach demonstrated characteristics that immediately distinguished her from recreational shooters or casual firearms enthusiasts. She selected a position that was slightly different from where the 3 Marines had been shooting, adjusting for what appeared to be minor variations in wind exposure and sightlines that weren't immediately obvious to observers. Her body positioning as she lowered herself into a prone shooting stance was textbook perfect, but incorporated subtle modifications that suggested adaptation to current conditions rather than rigid adherence to standard procedures. The way she settled into position showed familiarity with extended shooting sessions and understanding of how to maintain stability and comfort during lengthy periods of precision work. Blackthorn's scope adjustment procedure was particularly noteworthy because she made minimal changes to Morrison's existing settings, suggesting that she understood how to work within the rifle's current configuration rather than attempting to reconfigure it for her preferences. The adjustments she did make appeared to be based on her environmental assessment rather than personal shooting preferences. As Blackthorn prepared for her first shot, the tension among the assembled crowd reached levels that were almost physical in their intensity. Marines who had been skeptical about her qualifications found themselves genuinely curious about whether she could deliver on her confident claims. The 3 elite marksmen whose reputations had been devastated by the day's failures watched with combinations of hope, skepticism, and wounded pride. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone present understood that what happened next would either validate Blackthorn's unprecedented intervention or confirm that her confidence had been completely misplaced. Morrison's rifle, the same weapon that had failed to perform for one of the Marine Corps' most promising young marksmen, was about to be tested by a civilian contractor whose qualifications remained completely unknown. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made the decision to allow the demonstration to proceed, recognizing that stopping it now would leave too many unanswered questions and could potentially create more problems than it solved. But he positioned himself where he could intervene immediately if safety concerns arose, or if the situation began to deteriorate beyond acceptable parameters. The desert wind that had been causing problems for the Marines all afternoon continued to shift unpredictably, and the heat mirages that had been distorting downrange visibility remained as challenging as ever. The environmental conditions that had contributed to the unprecedented failures of 3 legendary marksmen hadn't improved. If anything, they had become more difficult as the afternoon sun continued to beat down on Range Charlie with relentless intensity. Blackthorn settled into her final shooting position with practiced ease, her breathing automatically adjusting to the rhythm that precision shooters develop through extensive training and experience. The rifle that had betrayed Morrison's legendary accuracy was now in the hands of someone whose background and qualifications remained a complete mystery to everyone present. The first shot would tell them everything they needed to know. The crack of the first shot echoed across Range Charlie with the sharp finality of a judge's gavel, cutting through the desert air and the collective held breath of nearly 40 observers. Before the sound had fully dissipated, the electronic scoring system's distinctive chime announced what everyone was straining to see. Center hit at 400 yards. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it was quickly suppressed as Blackthorn smoothly cycled the bolt action and acquired her next target without pause. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of the successful shot, only the fluid transition to the next engagement that marked the difference between recreational shooting and professional marksmanship. The second shot followed within 20 seconds of the first. Another chime from the scoring system, another center hit, this time at 600 yards. The murmur grew slightly louder, tinged now with something that might have been surprise, though it was too early for anyone to draw meaningful conclusions from 2 successful shots. But by the 5th consecutive hit, the murmuring had stopped entirely. The crowd that had been fidgeting with nervous energy and whispered conversations had settled into an unnatural stillness, their attention focused with laser intensity on the woman who was systematically engaging targets with the kind of mechanical precision that defied the chaotic conditions that had destroyed 3 legendary reputations. Staff Sergeant Patterson felt something cold forming in the pit of his stomach as he watched Blackthorn's shooting rhythm develop. Her pace was neither hurried nor hesitant. Each shot followed a consistent pattern of target acquisition, environmental assessment, and trigger control that spoke of extensive training and real-world application. More troubling was the fact that she was using his exact same rifle, firing at the identical targets under the precise environmental conditions that had caused his own spectacular failure. Rodriguez found himself unconsciously leaning forward, studying Blackthorn's technique with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that was challenging his fundamental understanding of marksmanship principles. Her body position was solid but not rigid, her breathing pattern was controlled but natural, and her scope work demonstrated familiarity with long-range shooting that went far beyond weekend hobby shooting. By the 10th consecutive hit, Morrison was experiencing something approaching cognitive dissonance. The rifle in Blackthorn's hands was performing flawlessly, delivering the kind of accuracy that had made him famous throughout the Marine Corps. But it was the same weapon, firing the same ammunition at the same targets, under the same conditions that had produced his own humiliating failure less than an hour earlier. The electronic scoring system continued its steady rhythm of confirmation chimes as Blackthorn progressed through targets at increasing distances. 12 hits, 15 hits, 20 hits. Each successful shot was delivered with the same calm efficiency, showing no signs of the pressure or stress that typically accumulated during extended precision shooting sessions. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been mentally preparing damage control strategies for what he expected to be an embarrassing demonstration of civilian overconfidence, found himself instead trying to process the implications of what he was witnessing. If Blackthorn could achieve consistent accuracy using equipment that had failed for 3 elite Marines, the problem clearly wasn't with the weapons or the range conditions. It was with something fundamental that his most experienced marksmen were missing. By the 25th consecutive hit, conversations throughout the crowd had stopped entirely. Junior Marines who had never witnessed precision shooting at this level were getting an education in what peak marksmanship actually looked like, while senior personnel were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something historically significant. The targets Blackthorn was engaging weren't the simple bullseyes used for basic qualification courses. Range Charlie's assessment targets were designed to challenge elite shooters, featuring scoring zones that required sub-minute of angle accuracy at distances that stretched the practical limits of individual small arms. The fact that she was achieving consistent center hits at these distances under adverse conditions, using an unfamiliar rifle, was moving beyond impressive into the realm of the theoretically impossible. Sergeant Thompson, whose primary concern had been preventing safety violations and protocol breaches, found himself documenting what he was witnessing with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that official reports would be required and that his observations might be scrutinized by investigators who wouldn't believe what had actually happened. Lance Corporal Brooks, who had been maintaining the official score sheet, realized that his documentation of Blackthorn's performance would likely be preserved as historical record. His handwriting, which had started neat and professional, was becoming increasingly hurried as he struggled to keep pace with the steady rhythm of successful shots. By the 30th hit, patterns were becoming clear that went beyond simple marksmanship skill. Blackthorn was adapting her shooting technique in real time to account for environmental changes that the 3 Marines had been fighting against rather than working with. When wind conditions shifted, her hold-off adjustments were immediate and precise. When heat mirages affected target visibility, her timing adjusted to take advantage of momentary atmospheric stability. The 40th consecutive hit prompted the first audible reaction from the assembled crowd, a low whistle from somewhere in the group of observers that was quickly hushed by the collective understanding that they were witnessing something that demanded respectful silence. Morrison found himself analyzing Blackthorn's technique with the same analytical intensity that had made him famous, but he was seeing approaches and adaptations that weren't covered in any Marine Corps training manual he had studied. Her method of reading wind patterns incorporated techniques he recognized from advanced long-range shooting schools that were typically restricted to special operations personnel. Her atmospheric assessment included factors that weren't taught in standard marksmanship courses. Rodriguez was experiencing the uncomfortable realization that Blackthorn's performance was highlighting gaps in his own training that he hadn't previously recognized. Her approach to environmental compensation was more sophisticated than anything he had learned during 15 years of professional shooting, incorporating variables and calculations that suggested access to advanced training programs that weren't available through normal military channels. By the 50th consecutive hit, the impossible was becoming undeniable. Blackthorn had already exceeded the best performance that any of the 3 Marines had achieved that day, and she was showing no signs of fatigue, pressure, or declining accuracy. If anything, her shooting rhythm was becoming more consistent as she continued, suggesting that she was entering the kind of flow state that elite performers achieve during peak performance periods. The scoring system's chimes had developed their own rhythm, a steady electronic heartbeat that marked the progression of what was rapidly becoming the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in Camp Thunderbolt's history. Each successful shot was destroying another assumption about what was possible under the day's challenging conditions. Patterson, Rodriguez, and Morrison stood frozen behind the firing line, watching their professional reputations being redefined by a civilian contractor whose background remained completely unknown to everyone present. The rifle that had betrayed their legendary skills was performing with mechanical precision in Blackthorn's hands, delivering the kind of accuracy that would have been remarkable under ideal conditions and was approaching the miraculous under current circumstances. As Blackthorn approached her 60th consecutive hit, the crowd of observers had grown to include nearly every off-duty Marine on the base, along with civilian contractors, visiting personnel, and senior officers who had been drawn by reports that something unprecedented was happening at Range Charlie. The woman who had requested to borrow a rifle just to test a theory was systematically rewriting the definition of marksmanship excellence, one perfect shot at a time. The 70th consecutive hit arrived with the same mechanical precision as all the others, but this shot carried additional weight because it represented a threshold that none of the three elite Marines had achieved during their catastrophic morning. Blackthorn had now surpassed their combined best efforts, using equipment that had seemed cursed in their hands, under conditions that had systematically destroyed their legendary reputations. But she wasn't slowing down. If anything, her rhythm was accelerating slightly as she moved into distance ranges that pushed the practical limits of individual marksmanship. The targets at 1,200 yards and beyond required not just exceptional shooting skills, but mathematical precision in calculating ballistic trajectories, atmospheric effects, and environmental compensation factors that challenged even the most experienced marksmen. The 80th hit came with a shot that seemed to defy physics. The target at 1,400 yards was barely visible through heat mirages that made the entire downrange area shimmer like water. But Blackthorn's bullet found its center with the same unwavering accuracy she had demonstrated at closer distances. The electronic scoring system's chime seemed almost anticlimactic, a simple electronic acknowledgement of what the assembled crowd was beginning to recognize as something approaching supernatural skill. Staff Sergeant Patterson felt his worldview fundamentally shifting as he watched Blackthorn engage the 85th target. This wasn't just superior marksmanship. This was a demonstration of capabilities that exceeded anything he had witnessed during his 12 years of professional shooting. Her technique incorporated elements that weren't taught in any Marine Corps school. Using environmental assessment methods that suggested training programs he had never heard of and experience that went far beyond civilian recreational shooting. Morrison found himself studying Blackthorn's breathing patterns, trying to identify the source of her remarkable consistency. Elite marksmen understood that breathing control was fundamental to precision shooting, but Blackthorn's respiratory rhythm seemed to be synchronized with atmospheric conditions in ways that suggested an almost mystical connection between shooter and environment. Her trigger control timing corresponded to momentary breaks and wind patterns that she seemed to predict seconds before they occurred. The 90th consecutive hit prompted reactions throughout the crowd that ranged from awe to complete disbelief. Marines who had spent years developing their marksmanship skills were witnessing a performance that redefined their understanding of what was humanly possible. The same environmental conditions that had systematically destroyed three legendary reputations were being used by Blackthorn as tools for achieving impossible accuracy. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison realized that he was documenting what would likely become one of the most significant marksmanship demonstrations in Marine Corps history. His initial concerns about protocol violations and administrative complications had been overwhelmed by the recognition that Blackthorn's performance represented something that transcended normal regulatory considerations. Rodriguez watched the 95th hit with the growing realization that his 15 years of professional shooting experience had failed to prepare him for what he was witnessing. Blackthorn's approach to extreme long-range shooting incorporated techniques that weren't available through standard military training programs. Her understanding of ballistic principles seemed to include factors that weren't covered in conventional marksmanship education. As Blackthorn approached her 100th consecutive shot, the tension among the assembled observers reached levels that were almost unbearable. The crowd that had started as curious onlookers had transformed into witnesses to history, understanding that they were present for something that would be discussed and analyzed for decades to come. The 100th target stood at the maximum range of the assessment course, 1,800 yards through atmospheric conditions that made accurate shooting a theoretical challenge for even the most advanced weapon systems. At this distance, a bullet required nearly 3 seconds of flight time, during which wind patterns, atmospheric pressure variations, and temperature gradients could affect trajectory in ways that demanded almost psychic prediction abilities. Blackthorn's preparation for this final shot was noticeably different from her previous rhythm. She spent additional time studying atmospheric conditions, making minute adjustments to her position, and conducting what appeared to be complex mental calculations. For the first time during her demonstration, she seemed to be approaching the limits of her remarkable abilities. The desert wind that had been shifting unpredictably throughout the afternoon chose this moment to present its most challenging test. Cross currents at different elevations created atmospheric conditions that would have defeated most marksmen before they attempted the shot. Heat mirages made target identification nearly impossible through conventional optical systems, but Blackthorn seemed to be reading environmental patterns that were invisible to everyone else. Her scope adjustments were minimal but precise, incorporating compensation factors that suggested understanding of atmospheric physics that went far beyond practical shooting applications. Her timing was synchronized with wind patterns that she somehow predicted several seconds in advance. The crowd of observers had grown completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing the climactic moment of an unprecedented demonstration. Marines who had been skeptical about Blackthorn's qualifications found themselves holding their breath, hoping that she could complete what would be the most remarkable marksmanship achievement in their experience. Morrison felt something approaching desperation as he watched Blackthorn prepare for the 100th shot. Part of him hoped she would finally miss, providing some validation for the spectacular failures that had destroyed his confidence. But a larger part of his analytical mind was fascinated by the possibility that she might actually achieve something that would rewrite the theoretical limits of individual marksmanship. The shot, when it came, seemed to hang in the desert air for an eternity. 3 seconds of flight time during which atmospheric conditions could shift, wind patterns could change, and the accumulated stress of 99 previous shots could finally affect even Blackthorn's remarkable consistency. The electronic scoring system's chime, when it finally sounded, seemed to echo across Range Charlie with the finality of a historical milestone. 100 consecutive hits, perfect accuracy under conditions that had defeated 3 of the Marine Corps' most elite marksmen. But Blackthorn wasn't finished. As the crowd struggled to process what they had witnessed, she was already acquiring the 101st target, a bonus shot at maximum range that would push her performance beyond theoretical possibility into the realm of legend. The target at 1,950 yards represented the absolute limit of the range's capacity, positioned at a distance where successful hits required not just exceptional skill, but favorable atmospheric cooperation that bordered on miraculous. The 101st shot would either complete the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in military history, or finally reveal the human limitations that had to exist somewhere within even Blackthorn's extraordinary capabilities. The silence that preceded this final shot was absolute, broken only by the desert wind that had been her adversary, and somehow her ally throughout the entire unprecedented performance. The 101st shot shattered more than just the distant target. It obliterated every assumption, every theoretical limit, and every comfortable belief that the assembled Marines had held about the nature of human marksmanship capability. When the electronic scoring system delivered its final chime, confirming a perfect center hit at the maximum range of Camp Thunderbolt's most challenging course, the silence that followed wasn't just respectful, it was reverent. Blackthorn set Morrison's rifle down with the same careful precision she had demonstrated throughout her unprecedented performance, treating the weapon with respect rather than triumph. Her movements were calm and controlled, showing no signs of the adrenaline rush or emotional release that typically followed extraordinary achievements. She simply stood, brushed dust from her knees, and began walking away from the firing line as if she had just completed a routine training exercise. The reaction from the crowd was initially delayed, as if their minds needed time to process what they had witnessed before their bodies could respond. Then, almost simultaneously, 40 Marines and civilian contractors began moving toward Blackthorn with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching worship. The woman who had been dismissed as an unqualified civilian contractor had just delivered the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in the history of Camp Thunderbolt. But it was Morrison who reached her first, his analytical mind finally breaking free from the shock that had paralyzed his thinking for the past 2 hours. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, carried none of the arrogance or dismissal that had characterized his earlier interactions with Blackthorn. Instead, it held the humility of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been completely restructured. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his words barely audible above the excited conversations erupting throughout the crowd. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What you just did, that wasn't luck, and it wasn't beginner's fortune. That was professional-level shooting that exceeded anything I've ever witnessed. Who are you?" Blackthorn paused in her retreat toward the observation area, turning to face Morrison with an expression that seemed to carry both understanding and something that might have been sympathy. Her response, when it came, was delivered in the same soft voice that had initially requested to borrow his rifle. But now that voice carried weight that commanded absolute attention from everyone within hearing range. "My name," she said simply, "is Sarah Blackthorn, and before I became a civilian contractor, I spent 8 years as a special operations sniper with assignments that don't appear in any official records you'd be able to access." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Special operations snipers represented the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship, individuals selected from the top 1% of already elite marksmen and trained in techniques that remained classified even decades after their development. The training programs, selection criteria, and operational capabilities of special operations snipers were subjects of legend and speculation throughout the conventional military. Patterson felt something between relief and embarrassment wash over him as Blackthorn's background began to explain the impossible performance he had witnessed. Special operations snipers weren't just superior marksmen. They were specialists trained in environmental assessment, atmospheric physics, and shooting techniques that went far beyond conventional military marksmanship education. Their capabilities were developed through training programs that remained classified and field experience that tested human limitations under conditions that conventional forces never encountered. Rodriguez found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about his own capabilities. Special operations snipers were selected from pools of candidates that included Marines like himself, experienced, proven marksmen with exemplary records and demonstrated expertise. The fact that Blackthorn had achieved selection and completion of programs that he had never been considered for suggested levels of skill and training that explained her seemingly impossible performance. But Morrison's analytical mind was still processing implications that went beyond simple military hierarchy. "Ma'am, if you're special operations qualified, why are you working as a civilian contractor? And why didn't you mention your background when we were questioning your qualifications?" Blackthorn's response revealed depths to her story that none of the Marines had anticipated. Her expression shifted subtly, showing emotions that hadn't been visible during her focused shooting demonstration. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones of experiences that went beyond professional achievement into areas that were clearly more personal and more painful. "I left active duty 3 years ago after my spotter was killed during an operation that I can't discuss in detail. After that, I found that I couldn't handle the operational environment anymore, but I still wanted to contribute to military training and capability development. Civilian contracting allows me to share knowledge and experience without the operational pressures that I can no longer manage." The explanation provided context that transformed the entire day's events from a simple demonstration of superior skill into something more complex and more human. Blackthorn's performance hadn't been about proving her superiority over conventional Marines. It had been about sharing capabilities developed through experiences that had cost her more than most people could imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been preparing administrative reports about protocol violations and unauthorized demonstrations, realized that the situation required completely different handling. Special operations veterans, particularly those dealing with trauma-related career transitions, represented personnel issues that demanded sensitivity and understanding rather than disciplinary action. But Blackthorn wasn't finished with her explanation. Her next words provided insights that would fundamentally change how the 3 Marines approached their own training and professional development. "The reason I was able to achieve consistent accuracy today wasn't because I'm more skilled than you are," she continued, addressing Patterson, Rodriguez, and Morrison directly. "It was because my training included techniques for dealing with psychological pressure that goes beyond what conventional marksmanship programs address. You were fighting against conditions that challenged your confidence and disrupted your established routines. I was trained to use those same conditions as tools for achieving focus and clarity." The distinction was crucial and revealed training methodologies that weren't available through normal military channels. Special operations snipers were trained not just to overcome adverse conditions, but to leverage them for enhanced performance. Their psychological preparation included techniques for maintaining focus under stress levels that would incapacitate conventional marksmen. Morrison found himself understanding for the first time why his analytical approach had failed so completely. His training had taught him to control variables and overcome challenges through superior technique and mental discipline. But Blackthorn's approach had been fundamentally different. Instead of fighting against environmental factors, she had incorporated them into her shooting process, using atmospheric conditions and psychological pressure as elements of her technique rather than obstacles to overcome. Rodriguez realized that his 15 years of experience had provided him with extensive technical knowledge, but had never exposed him to the advanced psychological training that allowed Blackthorn to maintain peak performance under conditions that had overwhelmed his conventional preparation. Patterson understood that his reputation for instinctive shooting had actually been a limitation when confronted with conditions that required adaptation beyond his established comfort zone. Blackthorn's training had included preparation for situations where conventional techniques were inadequate and new approaches were required. As the implications of Blackthorn's background and explanation began to settle throughout the assembled crowd, the atmosphere at Range Charlie shifted from amazement at impossible achievement to recognition of professional expertise that deserved respect rather than wonder. The woman who had seemed to perform miracles had simply been applying training and experience that went beyond what conventional Marines had been exposed to, sharing capabilities developed through sacrifices that none of them fully understood. The revelation of Blackthorn's special operations background had answered the technical questions about her extraordinary marksmanship, but it raised deeper questions that none of the Marines had expected to confront. As the initial shock of her performance began to settle, Morrison found himself studying her face with the intense curiosity of someone trying to understand not just what she had accomplished, but what it had cost her to develop such capabilities. The loss of a spotter wasn't just a professional setback for a sniper. It was a psychological trauma that could end careers and destroy lives. Snipers and their spotters developed bonds that went beyond normal military partnerships, relationships built on absolute trust and mutual dependence that made them effectively a single operational unit. The death of a spotter represented not just the loss of a teammate, but the destruction of a fundamental part of the sniper's professional identity. Patterson, who had worked with spotters during his own deployments, understood the implications of what Blackthorn had revealed. The fact that she was willing to share her capabilities despite the personal cost of her experiences suggested a level of professional dedication that went beyond simple duty or obligation. Her presence at Camp Thunderbolt wasn't about proving anything. It was about ensuring that other Marines could benefit from knowledge that had been developed through sacrifices that few people could comprehend. But Rodriguez was processing different aspects of Blackthorn's story, focusing on the gap between her demonstrated capabilities and the training that conventional Marines received. Special operations snipers weren't just elite marksmen, they were psychological warriors trained to maintain peak performance under stress conditions that would overwhelm normal human responses. Their training included techniques for managing fear, uncertainty, and pressure that weren't available through standard military education programs. Blackthorn seemed to recognize the questions that were forming in their minds, because she continued her explanation without being prompted. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone who had thought carefully about how to share difficult experiences in ways that could be useful, rather than simply traumatic. The operation where I lost my spotter was in Afghanistan, in terrain that required shots at distances beyond what most people consider possible with individual weapons, she said, her eyes focused on some point in the distance beyond the assembled crowd. We were providing overwatch for a convoy evacuation, and the environmental conditions were changing every few minutes. Wind patterns, temperature gradients, atmospheric pressure variations. Everything was shifting constantly. The description painted a picture of operational challenges that went far beyond the controlled conditions of even the most difficult training exercises. Combat sniping required not just technical expertise, but the ability to make life or death calculations under psychological pressure that could destroy rational thinking. The fact that Blackthorn had operated successfully in such environments explained capabilities that seemed almost supernatural when demonstrated under the relatively controlled conditions of Range Charlie. Morrison found himself understanding for the first time why his analytical approach had been inadequate when confronted with the day's challenging conditions. His training had prepared him to overcome obstacles through superior technique and mental discipline, but it hadn't included preparation for situations where conventional approaches were fundamentally insufficient. Blackthorn's experience had taught her to abandon established methods when circumstances required innovation and adaptation. "My spotter's name was David Chen," Blackthorn continued, and her voice carried emotions that revealed the personal cost of sharing these memories. "He was the best partner I ever worked with, and he died because I made a calculation error that put him in a position where he couldn't protect himself while providing me with the environmental data I needed for a critical shot." The confession hit the assembled Marines with the force of a physical blow. Combat veterans understood that operational failures often resulted from factors beyond individual control, but Blackthorn was clearly carrying responsibility for her partner's death in ways that had fundamentally changed her relationship with her profession. Rodriguez felt something twist in his chest as he recognized the psychological burden that Blackthorn was carrying. Survivor guilt was a common issue among combat veterans, but for snipers who had lost spotters, the trauma was compounded by the intimate nature of their working relationship and the precision required for their operational success. Every shot Blackthorn fired would be haunted by memories of the shot that had cost her partner his life. But Patterson was beginning to understand why Blackthorn had been willing to demonstrate her capabilities, despite the personal difficulty of discussing her background. Her presence at Camp Thunderbolt wasn't about personal achievement or professional recognition. It was about ensuring that other snipers could benefit from techniques and approaches that might prevent them from experiencing similar losses. "After David died, I couldn't handle operational deployments anymore," Blackthorn admitted, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Every time I got behind a rifle in combat conditions, I could see him in my scope picture, and I couldn't maintain the focus required for precision work. The military offered me training positions and administrative roles, but I needed to step away completely." The explanation provided context for her transition to civilian contracting work that went beyond simple career change. Blackthorn had left active duty not because of lack of capability or dedication, but because her traumatic experiences had made it impossible for her to continue in roles that required the kind of emotional compartmentalization that combat operations demanded. Morrison realized that Blackthorn's demonstration at Range Charlie had required considerable personal courage. Returning to precision shooting, even under training conditions, meant confronting memories and emotions that she had been struggling to manage for 3 years. Her willingness to share her capabilities despite the psychological cost suggested a level of professional commitment that humbled his own concerns about reputation and pride. "The techniques I use today for dealing with environmental conditions and psychological pressure, David helped me develop most of them," Blackthorn continued, her voice gaining strength as she shared memories that were clearly both painful and precious. "He was brilliant at reading atmospheric conditions and predicting environmental changes. His approach to spotter work included psychological support techniques that helped me maintain focus under conditions that should have been overwhelming." The revelation transformed Blackthorn's performance from a demonstration of individual excellence into something more complex, a memorial to a fallen partner and a continuation of work that had been interrupted by tragedy. Her 101 consecutive hits weren't just about proving capabilities, they were about honoring the memory of someone whose contributions had made those capabilities possible. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself understanding that the day's events represented something far more significant than a simple training demonstration. Blackthorn's presence at Camp Thunderbolt was part of a healing process that involved sharing knowledge developed through experiences that had cost more than most people could imagine. Her willingness to confront painful memories in order to help other Marines represented the kind of service that went beyond formal duty obligations. The 3 Marines who had experienced such devastating failure that morning were beginning to understand that their struggles with challenging conditions weren't personal failures, but opportunities to learn approaches that could prevent the kind of operational disasters that had shaped Blackthorn's life and career. The desert wind that had been their adversary throughout the day suddenly seemed like a teacher offering lessons that they hadn't been prepared to receive until someone with the right experience could show them how to listen. The transformation that began in the assembled Marines during Blackthorn's revelation continued to deepen as the implications of her story settled into their understanding. What had started as a day of professional humiliation was evolving into something far more profound, a lesson about resilience, purpose, and the true meaning of expertise that went beyond individual achievement. Staff Sergeant Patterson was the first to speak after Blackthorn finished sharing her story, but his voice carried none of the defensive pride that had characterized his earlier interactions. Instead, his words reflected the humility of someone whose perspective had been fundamentally changed by witnessing excellence that transcended his previous understanding of what was possible. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," Patterson said, his voice steady but clearly emotional. "When you first asked to borrow my rifle, I thought you were just another civilian who didn't understand what real marksmanship involved. I was so focused on protecting my reputation and defending my expertise that I couldn't recognize someone who had achieved levels of skill that I'd never even imagined." The apology opened a floodgate of similar responses from throughout the assembled crowd. Marines who had been skeptical about civilian involvement in military training found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about where valuable knowledge could originate. The distinction between military and civilian expertise suddenly seemed less important than the distinction between superficial competence and deep understanding. Rodriguez stepped forward with an expression that combined embarrassment with genuine gratitude. "I spent 15 years thinking I understood marksmanship, but what you demonstrated today showed me how much I still have to learn. The way you read environmental conditions and adapted to psychological pressure, those aren't techniques that are covered in any training program I've ever attended." Morrison, whose analytical mind had been processing the technical aspects of Blackthorn's performance throughout her revelation, found himself focused on different questions than the ones that had initially driven his curiosity. "Ma'am, you mentioned that David helped you develop the techniques you use today. Would you be willing to share some of those approaches with us? Not just the technical aspects, but the psychological methods for dealing with pressure and uncertainty." Blackthorn's response revealed the true purpose behind her presence at Camp Thunderbolt and her willingness to confront painful memories in order to help other Marines. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who had found meaning in tragedy and purpose in sharing knowledge that had been developed through sacrifice. "That's exactly why I'm here," she said simply. "David believed that the techniques we developed together could help other snipers avoid the kind of operational failures that cost lives. After he died, I realized that the best way to honor his memory was to make sure that his insights and innovations could benefit other Marines who might face similar challenges." The shift in atmosphere at Range Charlie was palpable as the assembled Marines began to understand that they were being offered access to knowledge that had been developed through experiences that few people would ever encounter. Blackthorn's demonstration hadn't been about proving her superiority. It had been about opening a conversation about advanced techniques that could save lives and prevent tragedies. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been observing the interaction with growing appreciation for its significance, made a decision that would have important implications for training programs throughout the Marine Corps. "Dr. Blackthorn, I'd like to discuss the possibility of formalizing your consultation role here at Camp Thunderbolt. What you've shared today suggests that there are training methodologies that we should be incorporating into our standard marksmanship programs. The proposal represented recognition that military training could benefit from expertise that existed outside traditional institutional structures. Blackthorn's background and experience qualified her to contribute knowledge that wasn't available through normal military education channels, and her willingness to share that knowledge despite personal costs made her an invaluable resource for improving training effectiveness. But Blackthorn's response revealed additional depths to her commitment that went beyond simple professional consultation. Her next words demonstrated understanding of military culture and training psychology that suggested careful thought about how to share advanced techniques without undermining confidence or creating dependency. "I'd be honored to contribute to training programs here," she replied. "But I think the most important lesson from today isn't about specific shooting techniques. It's about understanding that excellence requires constant learning and adaptation, even for people who have already achieved expert status. The moment we stop learning is the moment we start declining." The insight resonated throughout the crowd because it addressed the psychological aspects of the day's events that were more significant than the technical demonstration. Patterson, Rodriguez, and Morrison had experienced devastating failure not because they lacked skill or training, but because they had approached challenging conditions with assumptions that prevented them from adapting effectively. Morrison found himself understanding that his analytical approach to marksmanship, while valuable, had become a limitation when it prevented him from considering approaches that weren't covered in his established methodology. Blackthorn's performance had demonstrated the importance of remaining open to new techniques and perspectives, even when existing methods had proven successful in the past. Rodriguez realized that his 15 years of experience had provided him with extensive technical knowledge, but had also created comfort zones that made him resistant to approaches that challenged his established expertise. The day's failures had been opportunities to learn rather than threats to his reputation, but he had been too focused on defending his status to recognize the learning opportunities. Patterson understood that his reputation for instinctive shooting, while well-deserved, had made him overconfident about his ability to handle any conditions through natural talent and experience. Blackthorn's systematic approach to environmental assessment had revealed the value of combining instinct with analytical preparation in ways that he had never considered. As the afternoon sun began to set over Camp Thunderbolt, the Marines who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a routine training exercise found themselves participants in something far more significant. They had witnessed not just exceptional marksmanship, but a demonstration of how expertise could be shared across institutional boundaries in ways that honored the sacrifices of those who had contributed to its development. The woman who had quietly asked to borrow a rifle had transformed a day of failure into a lesson about resilience, adaptation, and the true meaning of professional excellence. Her 101 consecutive hits would be remembered and discussed for years to come, but the more important legacy would be the understanding that learning never stops, and that the greatest experts are those who remain humble enough to share their knowledge with others. As Blackthorn walked away from Range Charlie, she left behind Marines whose understanding of their profession had been permanently changed. The desert wind that had been their adversary that morning had become a teacher, and the woman who had seemed like an unlikely instructor had proven to be exactly the mentor they needed. In the growing twilight, David Chen's memory lived on in the knowledge that would help other Marines succeed, where he and Blackthorn had faced impossible choices. The lesson of Range Charlie would endure long after the targets were changed and the scores were forgotten. That true expertise lies not in never failing, but in learning from failure and sharing that knowledge so that others might succeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.